So witness A was a man who was arrested in January 1996. He was arrested at Forest Gate Police Station in relation to a completely separate matter. And on arrival at the police station, he asked to see a particular detective within the Met who was not available, and he ended up talking to or taken for a cigarette in the backyard, as things were done then. And he then immediately said, look, my life's at risk and I'm the next one that's going to get taken out. And I was the driver who drove a man to Rettendon on the night of the murders, and that man killed Tucker Tate and Rolfe. He gave a very detailed explanation of what happened. And as a result of that, the detective from the Met who dealt with him, who took him for a cigarette in the backyard, phoned up Essex Police, and that afternoon, a detective sergeant and a PC from Essex came down, interviewed witness A, and then subsequently went out with witness A in the afternoon when it was dark and asked witness A to direct them. They took him out in the police car, direct them to the venue where he says, or the route he says he took on the night of the murders, to show them where he'd gone. And witness A took them on a long drive and explained to them what happened in his account, effectively, of what happened. And he basically says that he picked up a stolen car on false plates from an address in Canning Town. He said that he drove to Palms Motel on the A127, where a man came out carrying a bag who was known to him, got into the car, passenger seat of the car. He then drove to a taxi office in Upminster, where that man got out and met another man and was handed a Browning pistol. And they then drove to an area known as Battlesbridge, which is not far from Rettendon, where they sat in the car park for a period of time. And then at a particular time, they then left and drove. And this is where it gets interesting. They drove down to there's what's called the Rettendon Turnpike, big roundabout. And as you come down to it, effectively, if you go straight across, you go to Rettendon and Workhouse Lane, where the murders took place. He says, no, we didn't go that way. He said, we took the next exit. And the next exit, if you follow it on a map, goes away from Rettendon, goes away. But what's interesting, he says, as he drove along, he says there was some greenhouses, some road furniture that he identified. He says, at this particular point, I turned left and I drove down an unmade road, single track, unmade road. And towards the end of that road, he said, I stopped, the passenger got out for a period of time, and then he got over a gate and walked across a field. He says he was gone about 30, 40 minutes, and then he came back. When he had set off, he had one bag, and in that bag was a pump-action shotgun. And when he returned, he had two bags. So he had a bag with the pump-action shotgun and the pistol, and he had a second bag that contained 4 kilos of cocaine. He then describes how he then drove back and the route he took back. And he's very, 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 very detailed in what he says. And when you follow through what he's saying, and it's all spot on. The road furniture, everything that he describes is spot on. Bear in mind, on the night he takes the police out, it's inclement weather, it's raining, it's foggy, it's horrible. So he's managed to find that road, and he's managed to show them that route, having never been there before. And even when we went down to examine that route, we drove past it twice. So he found this route. And interestingly, one of our Essex officers who works with us, he said, the route that he took and the distance between where he dropped him off and the murder scene across the fields, no one had realised how close that was. So effectively, his version of events is that the chap got out of the car, walked across the fields to Workhouse Lane, coming in from the other direction, and shot Tucker Tate and Rolfe dead and stole 4 kilos of coke. And that the arrangement for Tucker Tate and Rolfe to be down that lane was to do a drugs deal for 4 kilos of cocaine. That was the lure to get them there. He then gives details about what happened, how he drove back, how he met up, handed over the drugs to another individual. describes in very graphic detail the car, and he then describes how the following day he attended a bar in Woodford and collected £5,000 cash for his work or his role in driving. So that was the first day. He then goes on to do a series of interviews, one of which, bizarrely, the tapes break, and there is no record of that interview anywhere. The other two interviews are very detailed and corroborate what he says happened at Rettendon. He was taken out for a second time to the scene after being kept in custody for a couple of days. And where it gets interesting there is that on that last day that he was in custody, he effectively admits that he knew that they were going to be murdered in advance. At that point, he should have been arrested for murder or conspiracy to murder.
Mm-hmm.
What actually happened was nothing. They did nothing. They released him back to the Met. And what's quite interesting is that come out from the programme is that the SIO, Ivan Dibley, claims he's never heard of Witness A. And we also spoke to the person who made the written entry that effectively writes off his evidence. And again, that lady was a DI at the time. She says, I've never heard of Witness A. So you've got this bizarre scenario where you know, in January, 5 months before the arrest of Darren Nichols, Michael Steele and Jack Williams, you've got a man who is a very credible witness giving a very credible and compelling account of the murders. And the SIO, the man running the investigation, says, I've never heard of him, don't know what he's talking about. The DI on the job says, never heard of him, don't know what he's talking about. And yet you've got evidence. You've got 2 scene visits with officers' notes, and you've got 2 interviews and a third interview that mysteriously the tape breaks. When you combine all that together, you would have expected that there would have been fireworks going off, particularly when you see who he was talking about. The people he was talking about, the names that he was mentioning, were major criminals in the Met who were being targeted at the time. Now, if someone had just picked the phone up to the Met and said, we've got this chap in custody, Witness A. Number one, no one done any checks on Witness A, because if they had done, they'd have realised that he himself was quite significant. And secondly, if they picked the phone up and said to anyone in the Met, what do you know about A, B, C and D, fireworks would have gone off, because all of those people were linked to serious and organised crime, other murders, and importantly, police corruption. No one did that. They literally ignored everything he said. And it wasn't until we started our inquiries 3-4 years ago that one of the important factors that he talks about is the motive for the murders. He describes about the lure to get them down the lane for the 4 kilos, but he says one of the principal reasons why they were murdered was because Tony Tucker had stolen money from an armed robbery. And when we first started, it didn't make any sense. As we started investigating, talking to people, talking to Essex officers, Met officers, flying squad officers at the time, we uncovered the fact that there was an armed robbery, that the detail he was giving did relate to a real armed robbery, an armed robbery where £495,000 cash was stolen. And it does appear on the face of it, when you look at it, that there is very compelling evidence that that was probably the final nail in the coffin for Tucker, Tate and Rolfe, and that was the motivation. And that was the motive put forward by Witness A, and that was probably the final reason, if you like, that they were murdered. And it's all corroborated. So everything that Witness A talks about is corroborated. He doesn't tell the entire truth. We've never said that everything he says is completely true. There are bits of what he says where he's overheard other conversations and he's given his interpretation of what was said, and that's clearly wrong. But we've managed to get behind that, and we know why he said what he said, and we understand it. But you know, the bottom line here is that in January 1996, you had a very credible witness to the murders who was completely ignored. He went on to give evidence at the trial. So the defence found out about him and his account about 2 weeks before the trial. It was never disclosed. They asked for him to be brought to court to give evidence, and he came to court. He was serving in prison at the time. He came to court. He wasn't given the usual benefit of being able to read his statement and everything else. And he was sworn in, and under oath, he gave, or started to give, his story, started to tell the story. The judge, the trial judge at the time, closed him down immediately and refused to hear his evidence. They claimed that it was hearsay evidence, and he was unable to mention any of the names that he put forward or give any further details. And as a result of which, he wasn't believed. The jury didn't believe what he was saying. But what you did have at the time, and if Essex Police had done their job properly, you would have had two accounts. You'd have had the Darren Nichols account, which is, the car mechanic with no previous history of violence, no links to firearms, killed 3 men in cold blood with no motive, compared to the armed robbery, serious and organised crime, detailed and compelling evidence of being the driver, detailed and compelling evidence of the man who actually carried out the murders. If the jury had been given both versions of events, very unlikely they would have convicted Michael Steele.